cooperate with what you think that you're trying to do. Things come up, emotions come up, and thoughts come up, and you start to realize that in this space where you sit down with the intention of sitting up straight and following your breath and kind of meditating, and the next thing you know, your mind is somewhere else, or you're having some kind of emotional response, or something gets released. And I think through that experience, maybe initially, I don't know, I've meditated kind of on and off with different styles, different forms, and I don't know, I went on like a 5-week retreat in 2011, and sometime around that time, I started to really believe in determinism. I started to really believe that we don't really have any free will. I mean, I had an experience, I can't really describe it, but where I thought about, well, I didn't choose where I was born, I didn't choose my genetics, I didn't choose my gender, I didn't choose my parents, I didn't choose all this stuff. It just sort of happened. And then my early experiences, like everybody's, you don't really choose them. And when you're a baby, basically you cry, and either you get fed or you don't get fed. And then by the time you're actually able to make decisions, you've already got a pretty big storehouse of experiences that you've already had. And your current decisions are based on this storehouse plus whatever's going on in the present moment. And I guess I started to look at that a little bit more during meditation, or maybe it became a little bit more obvious during meditation. And I've really been kind of stuck on that ever since. And I'm sorry Matt isn't here today, because I was talking to him about it yesterday, and he's like, man, you just keep getting stuck on this thing. I don't understand. Like, what's the importance of this? Like, how is that helpful? I mean, if you could convince me, and I think on some level he's probably deterministic too, but I mean, if you could convince me, how is that helpful? And I don't know. I think, let me back up for a second, and maybe I'll throw this out there to the people that have been meditating maybe in the retreat. But in that space, let's say you sit down to meditate, and you watch your breath, and you straighten up your posture, and you're sort of in that space where you're just sort of observing what happens, just observing what happens. And then let's say one of two things happen. Let's say you get a little bit drowsy and you start to sort of doze off, and then at some point you realize that you've dozed off, and you sit up straight, maybe breathe a little bit, and you kind of come back into the posture. Or let's say, your mind just sort of trails off, and you're thinking about something else entirely, and then you realize that you're thinking about something, you're on some thought train somewhere else, and then you come back. What is it that brings you back? Because the thought that you have about what brings you back isn't what brought you back. That was after the fact, right? And that's the space that I'm really interested in. That space right there. And for people that have been in the retreat, I mean, if there's any way to study the mind, and I think a lot of people here that are philosophers or neuroscientists or whatever, this is an interesting, an N of one, right? This is the interesting experience where we're kind of looking at our mind directly, and not only reading about it, but actually studying it. What do you think that is? What is that space? I mean, what are people's experiences with it? And, just because you go in there with free will, right? You go in there saying, I'm going to sit here and meditate, or I'm going to do shikantaza, or I'm going to sit for this retreat. At least in my experience in retreats, I mean, lots of things happen, but a general trend for me in some retreats has been, I'm really physically uncomfortable and my mind goes completely nuts. And the more you sit, the worse it gets. And then by the end of the retreat, you're just ready to run away screaming, right? And then other retreats, you come in and you sit, and for whatever reason, the conditions, again, you don't want to judge anything, but it does seem like sometimes you just kind of settle into something, and then something completely different happens. But it has a lot to do with that space, right? That space between, like, this is what I'm intending to do and this is what's actually happening. And it can either reinforce sitting, or it can reinforce your crazy monkey mind. And I just kind of wanted to open up the floor and talk about that a little bit. I've got, I was rereading this book by Sam Harris. I don't know if anybody's read it, on free will. It's only 66 pages long. You can read it in like one sitting. It's really good. But I read that a few years ago, and it just solidified this sort of deterministic view that I had about the way that my mind works, right? But I don't know that I'm there anymore. So something's kind of shifting, and that's a whole other topic that we don't even have to talk about right now. So let's just talk about people's experience in meditation and what they think that space holds. What is that space? Okay? Either from a deterministic viewpoint or from some other viewpoint where you actually have free will.
We on Thursday night, people talk about what brings them back to Zen. Why didn't they quit? which most people do. But you're talking about when you're actually doing meditation, when your mind goes drifting off, what brings you back to it? What is that?
Yeah. What are people's?
Just for
What is that? Where does it come from? How do you develop it? Like if there's any change in meditation over time, doesn't it have something to do with that space? What is that space?
For me, that space is like liberation. And I say that to a certain extent is where I came from. We used to have this little line, and I'm sure there's something in Zen that's very similar. That's discipline brings joy. And I would constantly contemplate on that line because I'm just kind of like over time, it's just kind of like keep coming back, and I didn't know why, but every time I sit for an extended period of time, I'm like, I got a little bit more settled. So for me, it's been the experience of watching the meditation work on me, and I could hear from other people's experience, but for me, keep coming back. Constantly, like you can think of it like you're working out, like you're exercising your muscles. For me, it's just like when my mind is running amok, and I can catch it before it just goes down the corner around into grandma's house and back. If I can catch it before it does that, for me, that's what is the discipline of that piece of it, to just come back for a moment. If I can just catch it in that moment, that's what stops the cray-cray, because I can that's what I call it, my cray-cray moment. I talk to my kid, I'm like, you have a moment. Yeah. So it's just kind of like, I would never think of it, that discipline would actually bring some sense of joy, but for me it has. And I say that joy is a sense of liberation from the cray-cray. That's how I can explain it.
Yeah. That's interesting. I like the discipline. I don't know. Something that's attractive about discipline. I don't know why. For some people, and some people can't stand it. Reminds me of a quote. There's a guy, M. Scott Peck, Road Less Traveled. Anybody remember that book? Like the 70s. I don't know. It was like one of the first big self-help books. But his quote was, "With some discipline, some things are possible. With absolute discipline, anything is possible," or something like that. Sounds very military, kind of tough, right? But that discipline, right? So the discipline to sort of come back. Tell me about what the first thought is that you have when you're sitting and you realize that your mind is gone. And what's the first thought that you have after you catch yourself?
Mine is usually, oh, I did it again, something like that. I'm like, oh, for me, it's just like the noticing of like, oh, I'm like not where I'm supposed to be.
So do you think that the noticing came before or after you brought yourself back?
That's a good question. I think I'm already there, and then I'm noticing I'm there, and then I come back. That's been my experience, I think. But now I'm gonna have to really, when I'm there doing it again, because it'll happen. It always happens. So.
Well, it's like at least in my experience, it seems like the recognition that your mind is somewhere other than where you kind of thought that it should be or wanted it to be or whatever, like that recognition comes first, and then the thought is, oh, wow, I'm paying attention to something else, and then you sit up and you check your posture and all that kind of stuff. My question is more, what catches you?
For me, it's a feeling. I can tell I can feel it in my body when I'm not where I'm supposed to be.
But do you think that that's discipline? I guess is my kind of back to the discipline thing. Do you think that it's self-discipline that brings you back, or do you think that there's something even before that?
I have to marinate on that one.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm marinating on it too. That's why I thought it would be a good discussion. Maybe get some other people's opinion on what is that? Because it doesn't really feel like me, right? It feels like me after you catch yourself, and then you have the thought, oh, my mind, my whatever, you attach I, me, whatever to that. But the experience of catching, where does that come from? Because you think from a deterministic standpoint or from a neurophysiologic standpoint, there's got to be some little squirt of a chemical in there or whatever that then makes you realize that you then and where does that come from? That just kind of blows my mind. So, yeah.
Well, I think you mentioned this once. There is a brain study that shows when you make a decision, it was already made in your brain a microsecond before you were conscious of it.
Yeah, it's like they've done several experiments like that. It's like some of them show 300 microseconds. Some of them, they did an experiment where they were just showing, random numbers on a screen, and you had two buttons to press. So you had button A, button B, and numbers are flashing on the screen. And all they wanted you to do is press either button. There was no order, but to decide which button you're going to press and then tell them the number that was on the screen when you decided you were going to press it. And they had their brains hooked up, and they realized that the areas in your brain that start to light up when you make a decision were actually lighting up like 6 to 9 seconds before they were saying what number was on the screen. So the decision to press the button was happening way before they were even conscious that they were going to press the button, right? So they're pressing like button A, and then they look up and they go, oh, well, I saw the 7 right when I pressed the button. And that's when it happened. And they're like, no, it happened like 5 seconds before that. So if that's true, right? So if that's true, and let's do a thought experiment. If you could hook like a big net up to your head, and experimenters could basically tell you what you were going to do 5 seconds before you actually did anything, you would start to get the sense that they could either that they were controlling you, as opposed to, like if they were like, oh, now you're gonna, like if they could tell you without it altering your behavior, like, oh, now you're gonna go over here, or now you're gonna think about this. And like if somehow they could write it down and show you that they knew that it was happening before you actually did it, where does that put you? Like, where's the you that's there?
Well, I think my comment's going to be, I'm just like, I think Brendan should answer this question, but I'm just going to answer it anyway. You're kind of going along these lines, is like when we started talking about, okay, well, what is it that brings you back? And since they mentioned the post hoc rationalization, the idea that like the self imposes this narrative, okay, I decided to press the button. When in fact, you look at these studies and it says, no, that's not true. I think I saw Dan Dennett TED talk about this.
Yeah.
And I think when we're sitting and something snaps us out of that like internal monologue and we come back to just like where we are right now, I do sort of say, okay, I just brought myself back. But this is kind of, I think what you're saying is like I don't know that's necessarily true. I think like the self tells itself a story, and that story appears in conscious awareness to say, okay, you brought yourself back from the internal monologue. But I don't know if that's necessarily true. And if the question is, okay, well then, like, what is it? Maybe we're just noticing that we came back, but what is it that brought us back? And I would say, everything that attention is attached to, including the body. I mean, the body is the first thing that I think of. Mm-hmm. And when I'm sitting and snap out of the internal monologue, the first place I come back is the awareness of my embodiedness. And the body tells me something that says, hey, by the way, this is still going on here. You're not living in the internal monologue. Mm-hmm. So I think what brings it back is like our being people in the context of a body that is also connected to all of this. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know, there's signals coming in from the cosmos is my, I guess, the mystical way of putting it.
Yeah. Well, let me speak to that before I forget, because you have in one of the Buddhist principles, it may come from Hinduism, form, feeling, thought, impulse, and consciousness are the 5 so-called skandhas or aggregates, heaps of a sentient being, 5 basic divisions in our consciousness, right? Form, matter, feeling, thought, impulse, and conscious. Impulse, being the 4th skandha just before you reach just consciousness, is often referred to as mental formations, motive, desire. There's a bunch of terms associated with it, and it's when it's articulate, when it's talk about it, it just goes on and on and on, because it has a parallel to everything else. So it's kind of like the underlying, subconscious, the subliminal. Where's this urge really coming from? And it sounds like we're talking about the same kind of thing. And so you would have parallel in early Buddhist primitive, I say psychology, to this idea of the, brain. It would be called manas, or manas is alaya vijnana, the seed consciousness, coming up with this, and you think you're coming up with it. And one of the expressions in Buddhism, which Dogen used a lot, is Buddha seeking Buddha, meaning Buddha is awakened nature. So the theory is that the awakened nature is seeking to wake up, and we just happen to be the vehicle for it, right? And so it's kind of like your DNA. It's like DNA is expressing this and spreading the genetic code to your children. You know, you're just the carrier, right? It's a little bit like that.
Well, it's interesting because I heard some people talk about their experience in meditation, how it's like helpful when you're teaching middle school, right? Keeps you more centered, right?
Yes.
But isn't that just the same thing that we're doing on the cushion? In other words, aren't you catching yourself when you're about to lose your temper? You know, which is sort of like catching yourself when your mind is, I mean, in other words, we're training ourselves in a way. I mean, again, I don't know. It's hard not to look at this in kind of a linear sort of like karate. Now I'm a green belt. Now I'm a whatever. You know, like you're trying to develop something, right? But that's the thing that you're developed. Those are the places where you notice that your practice is having a benefit when you're off the cushion. But you're probably not also the one that's catching yourself getting angry, right? So if it's an unconscious thing, how do we right? If it's unconscious, how are we developing the unconscious, right? And we're probably doing it by sitting, but why would we continue to sit if, again, kind of back to the whole deterministic thing, like it just like sort of wraps over and over, right? The thing is, if we don't have any control over it, right? And what I'd say, but I mean, like we can come to the Zendo and we can sit, but all of the factors that led to us wanting to come to the Zendo and sit already happened, right? So when you're deciding that you're going to come to the Zendo and sit, the decision is already made, right? In other words, like today, if you weren't already at the retreat and you were trying to decide, am I going to go to the Zen Center? By the time you thought, should I go to the Zen Center or not today? The decision was already made. You had already made it before you had the conscious thought that you wanted to come to the Zen Center, which is kind of weird. Like that's really strange.
It depends on what you mean by you.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think there's an implicit assumption that there's an observer observing. We're the observer. It's very Descartes. I don't know, but there's an observer observing ourselves, and I think since I mentioned I was a resident, I think the biggest impact I had as a resident was doing the sutras at 6 a.m. I was like exhausted and just like chanting them, and then like a word would catch you, and you're like, what does that mean? You know, like, totally. And it was like dark. You're like, what? And one of the sutras was, I can't remember it, but it's like, this moment arises with mind. This moment itself is mind. And like that gave me the impression, instead of me being the observer, observing my own mind, observing the external, like this is all merging. It's like a big bubble that's boiling up together, and I'm part of that. And it's like, it's not just like observing me and it and stuff. It's like actually kind of sinking into that and feeling it. And sometimes your mind just does run wild. Like I've had, I think the first 6 months when I would meditate here, I would get this thought bubble. It's like if I had gone and killed everyone in the room, I was like, where does that? I think I talked to Sensei and
I've been there.
Yeah, he's like, yeah, that comes up. I'm like, it does for everyone. Everyone's thinking that. He's like, yeah, and then
Especially if you're the leader.
it just passed. And then so I think like that's not me, or like it's just like kind of we're kind of all swimming in the mind, all the time. Not our own, other people's, like the environment. And so I would kind of question or challenge whether like we're observing it so much as like A, and then B, whether when your mind is running wild, if that's necessarily like worse than having your mind being still and, tranquil and happy and all that's blissful and all that stuff. I think they're both aspects of it. I think on a pragmatic level, like when you see someone whose mind's running wild and they don't know it, that's really scary.
Mm-hmm.
If the person knows it, like really knows it, and some like instinctual, you're like, oh, good, you're gonna be fine. Like, but when someone's like, and I've seen like people who are manic and they don't know it, and you're like, you should really just don't go out tonight, and like, so I think there's all these like Western distinctions that we're bringing to Buddhism that make it kind of crazy town when you're trying to like figure out like what exactly. And I think the Theravada school, they did that. They're like the Dharma. They're like, there's impulse and there's body. Have you ever seen the charts of that? It's like a flow chart. It's like body, emotion, thought about the emotion, about the body and stuff. I think there's some usefulness to that, but I think with Mahayana Buddhism, it moved a little bit beyond that. It's just like, it's the experience, it's the experience that can't be like broken down into component parts necessarily, though we want to do it, of course, and make sense of it.
Yeah. I guess when you start to think about the experience that you're having, and the experience that you're having is that your mind is actually created after the moments when all the inputs go in to make your decisions, it's kind of freaky. It's kind of weird, right?
Just a quick comment on that. There's a famous anecdotal story. It turned out that uses a koan, a riddle, to try to answer to. In the Rinzai practice, many of the 1,700 of these kind of stories. And this one was about two monks that Dogen would quote often, and they were always trying to express to each other what they thought the meaning of all this was, like we're trying to do here. And one said to the other, he said, "I think it's like a donkey staring into a well." And if you think of a real donkey staring into a well, you know, smell the water, probably thirsty, right, that kind of thing. So it's becomes a metaphor for us in our practice. And the other guy says, "I think you have about 80% of it. I think it's like the well staring at the donkey." So I think that's what Joseph is talking about here. It's like mind doesn't seem to be us looking out through our eyeballs into something else. It seems to be like it's looking back at us. And there's a famous saying, form and reflection behold each other. That conjures up an image. Precious mirror. Form and reflection behold each other.
It's a bit of a black box, but we know it works, you know, because if you think about addiction, addiction is repetitive behavior, whether it's, you know, porn addiction or gambling or whatever, drugs. I heard a definition once, it's repetitive behavior. A person can't stop and is uncomfortable for another person to watch. If you think about that. And so we can see it in other people. We're like, oh, they're addicted to whatever it is, their phone or sex or drugs or money. But I think that's why sitting is so useful there's different levels of addiction, right? Like we're addicted to thoughts, or we're all addicted to status.
Everything.
You know what I mean? Like even when you're sitting here, you're like, where's my status in this? Like we're all, because we're so conditioned by our
We're
environment.
addicted to air.
To what?
Air. Oxygen.
So we know it works. Like you take addicts and you have them, we're all addicts in some way or another. You have them meditate, that pause or whatever it is, or that opportunity for freedom, even if it's somewhat contrived, is there, because you'll start seeing them be like, you know what, I don't feel like watching porn for 10 hours straight. I'm gonna watch it for 5 or whatever it is, you know, like whatever their thing is. And I think what we're doing is just a more subtle aspect of that we're addicted to thoughts. And we're like, why am I addicted to thoughts? It's such a weird thing to be addicted to. We can't kind of totally get out of it, but we all know that sitting works. So we're trying to go back and figure out why it works.
Trying to develop an addiction to sitting.
Trying to develop an addiction to an explanation why sitting works.
I think sitting works because, well, this is my first time actually, you know, practicing sitting like this with you guys, and I still haven't really practiced it because we missed it, you know, the real sitting. But I often try to do my forms of meditating, which I do at home, and I just sit on the floor, which is in Indian style. And then when my legs start to cramp up or whatever, I'll stretch them out, and then I'll transition my sitting into stretching. But I have to be in a silent environment, right? And I also meditate when I'm driving, like in the car, long distances. Sometimes, you know, I like just total silence. And then, of course, the universe will send some negative something coming down the way, and they're just like, flick me off, or blow the horn, or someone swerves over into your lane, or, you know, it breaks your focus. But then you come back, you know, when
Here
it all
we hit you
kind
with a stick, but you have to ask for it.
when it all, you know, settles down. But I feel like, you know, like everyone has said, you know, like, and especially you, like being addicted to so many different things in life that's just like natural kind of addictions. But I think sitting allows you to be still in the now, in the moment, and it gives you the opportunity of just releasing all the activity that's always going on, whether it's learned behavior, whether it's someone that you're attached to or something is trying to, kind of force upon you or pull you towards or whatever like that. So whenever you sit and you just be still and you be quiet, it kind of gives you the opportunity to just let go of all of it, and then it kind of opens you up more for clarity, just, becoming more with one with self. And, I guess the creator of the universe or whatever like that. So, yeah, that's my
I like
take.
the big exhale that you did.
Yeah.
There's a certain amount of freedom. Right? All of a sudden, you're not locked into what your mind
Exactly.
normally does. And I guess that's probably what brings us back. We're trying to develop. We could get into a whole topic about habit development too. I mean, like people want to exercise, right? 22% of people that want to exercise actually exercise. We want to develop a habit of sitting. I mean, the way that you develop. I was reading. I don't know. I guess I was thinking about doing a talk on this before too. But just the brief synopsis is. To develop a habit to do anything, you have to move. Initially, you have the freedom to be able to do the thing that you want to develop a habit of doing. And then when you start doing it regularly, all of a sudden you no longer have the freedom to choose that you want to do it regularly. And then you rebel against that, which is why we fail, right? But if you continue to do it, then it just becomes something that you don't have. There's no thought process involved anymore. It's not like, oh, I have to go do this, right? Now, this thing that I wanted to do in the beginning that I thought was going to make me feel better becomes this, it transitions from this thing that you don't really want to do that's impinging on your freedom to something you don't even think about anymore. And that's kind of, I guess, what we want sitting to do, right? Because it's not always comfortable. Yeah. Actually, it's mostly not comfortable.
Also, to respond to that, Brian, I think I'm still kind of making this transition myself, but when we start out, particularly with sitting, and it's like exercise, it's where it's like you view it as this goal. And one of our items of liturgy talks about sitting, and it says, making effort without aiming at it. And I think we all, I shouldn't say that, but I definitely started out with the aim. Like, okay, I'm going to sit and I'm going to save myself from suffering. I'm going to become a happy person. I'm going to become a Buddha. And that's like what, and kind of what you're talking about, transitioning from that kind of goal-directed, I'm going to make this, my thing, to where it just becomes a part of your life, you don't sits you or whatever. That transition, like, kind of helps you into maturity in your practice, I think. And again, I'm still making that transition. I'm not saying I've arrived, but it's kind of a nice thing to get into once you stop making it, the object of your practice, and it starts just being practice.
It's weird though, right? I mean, you definitely go through stages. And I think that's true for everybody. And I think to hear something about making effort without aiming at it when you're still the person that wants to get in here like you want to start a new exercise regimen, it doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, I think to talk about it from a standpoint of being, there when you're here, but, I guess my point is, we recognize that it does something for us, right? So we want to do it, kind of like exercise, we want to do it. And I don't know how I got from free will to this, but here I am. I didn't have any control. It was completely determined. I couldn't help myself.
Well, one of the things about the skandhas is indicated in the Sharingama Sutra and a couple other places in the literature, Dogen, is you start out sitting in form. Form is the material world, and we all know what that is. And you progress into what's called sensation, where the line between you and the cushion becomes fuzzy. It starts turning numb, so that's moving into sensation. A simple example. The idea is that you can end up sort of leaving form behind, where the form becomes very amorphous of your experience. It's not so cut and dry. I'm sitting here on the cushion in the environment. So that's moving into sensation. And from sensation, you move into perception, which is influenced by conception. But you could say you begin leaving sensation behind as you adapt. It's like sensory adaptation. We adapt to the weight of our clothes. We no longer sense the weight of our clothes, right? So now we're moving into the level of leaving sensation behind. Then moving into motivation, mental formations, desire, all that stuff, impulse, right? That fourth one, that weird fourth, skanda. The theory is that you would then get to a point where you're no longer sitting for any of those reasons, subliminal or not, or conscious. You don't know why you're doing it, right? And so now you've moved into, you can say you go from form only to move into sensation, sensation only, leaving behind form, perception only, leaving behind sensation, motive or mental formations, leaving behind perception, sensation, all the rest. Finally, into consciousness only is the way the chant in Chicago express it, where you're sitting in consciousness only. Consciousness can be aware of motive, can be aware of impulse. Consciousness, we can be conscious of a perception or conceptions that we have. We can be conscious of sensation, and we can be conscious of form. But at this point, we're no longer, in a sense, conscious of any of those. We're just conscious. You know, like you were when you're a kid, sometimes just ding dong, kind of not aware of anything in particular, but fully conscious, right? So that's where I think this fits in with the progress of meditation that we're talking about. How you what keeps bringing you back. At some point, you would have to say, I cannot name it. There, you know, it doesn't translate into anything, into words, or no longer even any reason to do it.
Yeah.
That's where it gets weird.
And interesting, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think back to how you encouraged us to think about the what on this retreat. The what. And speaking of addiction, you can be pretty addicted to just language in your head. And so that's kind of how and why, right? And so it's an interesting experience to focus on what is this experience, and it certainly does keep you also from being too goal directed. Oh, I'll stay here 50 minutes without moving a leg, and it becomes a different experience that's ultimately more fruitful.
These two guys are keeping their silence. We're not going to call them out.
So do you guys sit at home or outside of coming to the temple, to the center?
Probably all the varying degrees. Yeah.
We recommend both. They're different. Sitting here in a group is different.
I live here, so I don't sit outside of home.
So when you sit in a group versus when you're sitting alone, like when you're in a group, is there a different like energy or something that kind of is like magnified more so than when you're by yourself?
It's kind of like having a support group for your meditation.
It's weird, even though you know nobody's watching you when you're sitting in the room with everybody,
Yeah.
you still hold to the idea that somebody is, more so than when you're alone. When you're alone, you're just like, well, I could just get up and leave. But when you're here, you're like, well, that was disrupted. So
Right.
A little peer pressure.
So it kind of gives you more discipline, not necessarily a self-discipline, but it gives you, I guess a little bit more accountability.
Yeah. Even though you know nobody cares. Just like,
Yeah.
we're all facing the wall. Nobody's watching.
Exactly.
Yeah. But there's also support too.
We are watching.
But it's also, I think there's some support too. It's not just like, oh man, I don't want to give up on this meditation because I don't want them to think that I'm, giving up.
Right.
It's also like, I think when everybody's doing it and you're together and everyone's quiet, it, like you were saying, there's, I don't want to say energy, because I don't necessarily know, I can't describe it beyond that.
Right.
But like, you do, when there's people next to you, you can kind of sense them sitting there with you. You know that they're in it with you, and maybe everybody's in their own head, but at the same time, it's like it's an oddly social activity.
Yeah.
And kind of collective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that goes back to free will and role of the environment. So also, the environment is arguably better if there's that support system.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, to talk about kind of the stages, like I'll go back to exercise. I mean, if you're trying to develop a habit of exercise, being in a group setting is helpful, right? If you're trying to develop a habit of meditation, you can do that on your own, and if that doesn't work, you can come into a group setting and develop a habit. And then once you've developed a habit, then you can start investigating this weirdo space we're talking about. And if you get wrapped up in the whole free will question, you can come talk to me, because I've been wrapped up in it for 8 years. But I think that the solution. I think just to kind of wrap up a little bit, because I know we're running out of time, but we didn't really talk. We talked a little bit about free will, but I mean, the thing is, there's sort of 3 views from a philosophical standpoint. One of them is determinism, which is all the inputs that are ever going to be there are there, and you're making decisions based on things that have already happened, and you don't really have free will. It's just an illusion. The other view is a libertarian view, which is not political libertarianism, but it's this idea that there's something like a soul, or that there's something like karma. But I think when they're talking about karma, they're talking about karma from previous lifetimes, not just reactions that have happened in this lifetime. That there's something outside of the physical universe that you are, that you're somehow not beholden to what's already happened. And then there's a third view, which is compatibilism. I always have a hard time with that word, but that's the idea that determinism is true in some sense, that we don't have free will and on one level, but that everything that's happening is actually happening inside of us. So even though you get that little shot of neurotransmitter or whatever, that's still inside of you, right? But you don't have as much free will as you think you do. And I think from that standpoint, which is kind of where I've come, where some philosophers kind of fall on one side or the other. There aren't any real serious philosophers that think that it comes from outside the physical world. So philosophers generally aren't arguing libertarianism; they're arguing determinism versus compatibilism. And you can read a lot about this, and you're like, oh, it's definitely, determinism definitely makes sense. You can read a lot about compatibilism, and it seems like that makes sense. And from a Buddhist view, if you go back, I've forgotten what the sutras are, but there's some sutras that some earlier stuff in the Pali Canon, where the Buddha these sorts of arguments were going on 2,500 years ago. And I think he basically took a very pragmatic view, and he said, if you're deterministic, he didn't use that word, but if you're deterministic, then basically you have no reason for moral activity. You can just sort of justify anything because, all of it's all there. And if I kill somebody, then it was their karma. And, I guess that's falling into the libertarian view. I mean, it gets and then if you go kind of the other extreme, he didn't see any evidence that there was anything outside of the physical world that was influencing you. In other words, I think it probably depends on what school of Buddhism you look at, but from a no-self standpoint, there's nothing outside influencing what's going on here. That's all right here. And I think the point that I kind of am coming to is that you can increase the amount of free will that you have. Whether we actually have it or we don't have it probably isn't the question. The question is, how do you increase the amount of free will that you have, or the amount of freedom that you have, which comes back in some ways to discipline, right? And it comes back to sitting on the cushion and having a little bit more freedom to work with that space that we're talking about, and to bring yourself back if you start to lose your temper in a way that's not helpful, or you can catch yourself more and provide yourself with more freedom, which I think is one of the reasons why we come here. We come here because we want, again, on one level, we want to change. On another level, you shouldn't be sitting with any sort of goal in mind. But I think it depends on where you are on this spectrum.
I think the traditional analysis of that is the end of suffering comes about through the relinquishment of craving. And so we all know when we're craving something, no matter what kind of addiction it is that we're craving, we know what it is. And there's a payoff. It works. Drugs work. Alcohol works. Everything works, right? Everything makes you feel better. So you have a pleasure center, you have pleasure circuits, and you have pain circuits, right? You want to fire the pleasure circuits. And so this is a natural thing to recognize craving and not act upon it. Then you start to experience withdrawal. Right? You're withdrawing from the craving, and it can be painful, especially in extreme cases, heroin, alcohol, and so forth. So I think where you would land on that, what keeps bringing you back to craving is like the addictions you were talking about. Gaku-san here, when you were talking about addiction, it made me think of him, but not for the reason you might think. Gaku-san is a forest ranger, and by training, and his company does remediation of privet and kudzu and invasives. So if you think of addictions as like invasive plants in your garden, right? What's wrong with addiction? Well, it's going to take over and wipe out everything else. Nothing else can survive, right? That's the nature of an invasive. So this idea is that if I don't relinquish craving, it's going to take over, right? It's going to just keep growing and growing and growing, and it's going to take over.
In rats, there's a famous experiment where they were, I think, studying memory, but the experimenter did a brain surgery, putting an electrode in the rat, and he missed. And he happened to hit the reward center, the pleasure center. And rats with the electrode there will ignore food, they will ignore sex, they will ignore water. Rat mothers who are normally fiercely protective of their children will abandon their children and like go run over an electrified grid to just to get the stimulation. In humans, it's not quite so powerful, but yeah.
That's really the root of addiction, and it's craving, but it's craving for that pleasure fix. I didn't mean to.
So to me, it seems like free will would be somewhat compatible or comparable to mind over matter, in a sense.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Because I too have put free will under a microscope for a number of, I don't even wrote a book about it, but there is will, there is free will, and then what I call dominant free will, which is when we, it's our concepts of power, how we can get others or to do what we want. Dominating free will certainly overlaps with the criminal justice system. But also there is dominant free will amongst our environment. Whenever you say free will, you cannot help but hear the words God gift because of our Christian concepts that we, as human beings, are gifted with free will. I wrote a book called Code of the Third Millennium Warrior, which is on Amazon. Code of the Third Millennium Warrior, which is on Amazon.com. And my concept of where that comes from is that something that is sort of diminished, and a lot of times I see it diminished in Zen talk, which is a warrior spirit. Something with the Dharma was very emphatic about it. But the warrior spirit is something which I believe is a God gift, and it's something that in Christianity is sort of dismissed because Christianity is based on a concept of the victimized innocent. But in essence, my idea of addiction is when the warrior spirit is either lost or forgotten. And the warrior spirit is something that makes us all unique. Human beings are unique because we're the only species that are driven to achieve.
Right.
We have a will center, which is considered a third chakra or a solar plex chakra, which is, if empowered, we can achieve amazing things. I think in many ways, it is the denial of our warrior spirit that is the delusion. And it is not to embrace our warrior spirit, is the flaw. And a lot of times, because of Christianity, I think there's a degree of turn the other cheek and don't apply your. But as with the yin and the yang symbol that we all are familiar with, a little bit of the light and the darkness, a little bit of the darkness and the light. But what a lot of people aren't familiar with is the yin and yang is a frozen iconic image. And in reality, it is in motion and it is spinning. So you have to ask yourself, what is it that's holding the light and the dark in balance? And my concept of that was our warrior spirit, our free will. The thing that holds us in balance while life is spinning is the idea that we have some control over it. And that control, whether it be to choose to be whatever, whether we choose to surrender, conquer, or neutralize, which are normally our three choices, is up to us, and there is the freedom. An imposed free will, which I also think is uniquely arrogant of Christianity, is that God has only gifted people with it. And when you come up with this concept of, how can an earthquake kill thousands of people? How could there be a God? As if to think that nature doesn't have free will. And then you start talking about the idea of an empowered free will over another free will. And again, the criminal justice system is really about power. It is about someone who dominated their will over another person, and or whether or not we choose the light or the dark of our consciousness and decide, okay, I am going to be the type of person that's going to destroy an entire city so I can rule over it, or I'm going to be the type of person that's going to build an entire city just to rule over it.
Seems like your warrior spirit kind of goes back to the idea of discipline and the ability to sort of put your attention and your action in a certain direction, right? I mean, and you have a particular idea about that, but what I was going to say is that, just to kind of wrap this up, is that the Buddha, I'll paraphrase the Buddha, but basically said that where you put your mind and what you attend to that is where your mind is going to bend and incline, right? So I think the main point is that we have to be careful where we put our attention, right? And that's what meditation is for. That's kind of what we're coming back to. Your model is a little bit more complex than that. But,
well,
yeah.
The idea that in Buddhism is a passive or pacifist practice is, I guess, what I am kind of distilling. I think it takes a tremendous amount of dedication, a tremendous amount of discipline just to sit. And that requires a tremendous amount of will, a tremendous amount of will center, and certainly a lot of complex thoughts and orchestration to put yourself in a patterning of doing this on a regular basis in order to achieve your will, which is the idea of a Buddha consciousness. It's kind of like walking into your messy bedroom and going, wow, I can imagine it being clean, but before I can get this room clean, I'm going to impose my will to clean it. And that's kind of how I see it. There is a degree of embracing one's warrior spirit, not as something destructive at all, something that's absolutely constructive and filled with life. To build an orphanage rather than to destroy, a system of practice and breathing. So I think there is a very virtuous side to the warrior spirit that I'm calling attention to.
Yeah. We're a little bit over time. Do you want to wrap up anything, Sensei?
Not really. I think we can close with the closing verse.
All right.
To that point, though, Alex, being in the law, criminal justice system, we say death, the punishment of death. Death cannot be a punishment because everything dies. It's the imposition of death on somebody at your choice, not theirs, by the means that you choose, not theirs. That's the punishment. The death itself is cannot be a punishment.
Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it.
Thank you all for your patience and listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The newcomers, if you will join me, I'll give you a few documents.
Yeah.
You need, these legal trade